Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining. I'm Anu Narayanan, Associate Director of the RAND National Security Research Division, or NSRD. NSRD advances understanding of the world's most pressing security threats and develops policies and strategies to help U.S. and allied governments mitigate and defend against those threats. Our research priorities include averting a great power war, i.e. World War III, managing the risks and opportunities posed by advanced technologies, preparing for the worsening impacts of climate change on geopolitics and national security, strengthening alliances, and ensuring the health and readiness of national security personnel. All of our work is undergirded by a commitment to help train the next generation of national security strategists and policymakers. A couple of housekeeping items before we begin. We're planning to have time for a short Q&A section at the end. If you do have questions about the research, please post them in the Q&A forum. We'll post links relevant to today's presentation in the chat also for you to follow along. On to the webinar today. This is the first in a special series of RAND policy labs called Rise of AI. RAND experts are studying the implications of artificial intelligence across nearly every policy domain, and we want you to hear directly from our researchers on this topic. I'm happy to welcome you to today's session on a very important topic, the rise of generative AI and how it can enable bad actors to conduct social media manipulation. This work was conducted within NSRD. I'm going to introduce you to our two speakers who I'm thrilled to have here with us today. First is Nathan Bosha Mustafaga. He's a policy researcher at RAND, where he focuses on Asian security issues. His research interests include Chinese foreign policy, Chinese military strategy, Chinese influence operations, the Korean Peninsula, and U.S. military force posture and strategy in Asia. Next, we have Bill Marcelino, who is a senior behavioral scientist at RAND, professor of policy analysis at the Purdue RAND Graduate School, and lecturer at Carnegie Mellon University and Johns Hopkins University. Bill develops AI applications, a key example of which is RAND Lex, which is RAND's proprietary text analytics suite. His research focuses on information as a warfighting function, AI technology application and acquisition for DoD, military resilience, and misinformation and disinformation, and conspiracy theories over social media. With that, I'll turn it over to Nathan and Bill to take it away.
Hi, all. So I'm going to kick us off here, but great to be here and to work with my colleague, Nathan. So basically, we want to talk to you about how generative AI may really affect and transform information warfare, and in particular, a case study involving Chinese efforts, PLA efforts, and Bicheng, who is an example of a researcher doing great work in this area, or important work in this area. So, and I'm trying to make my screen advance here. There we go. So when we say generative AI, what we mean is the most recent class of transformer-based models that generate content. So things like large language models, like ChatGPT, Claude you may have heard of, but also things like Stable Diffusion and other ones that can produce content. In the past, generative AI, information operations involving computational resources to make them automated, we've placed them into sort of three categories. The very first ones were really low level, very procedural, kind of easy to spot, and spewing out sort of very mechanically sounding content. So more about volume and really not very tailored or skillful. The second part was moving on to machine learning applications. So you might have videos that were edited or manipulated. You might be able to generate some content procedurally that was a little more human sounding, maybe orchestrate bots or artificial synthetic persona online in slightly more realistic ways. But it was really marked by any kind of like human inspection with a critical eye you could detect. Now what we're calling the third generation of this is really high quality stuff. And generative AI means you can make high quality information or content, whether this is, potentially videos, text content, interactions over social media, but also to do this in a really tailored way. And we'll talk in more detail about this, but essentially the ability of these modern generative AI models, these transformer models, to be fine-tuned to a specific population, a particular language or way of speaking, a particular context, that makes them possibly be highly tailorable, very advanced, and to really have at the high level, high quality content that's put out at scale. So a lot of talk in the last few years, or the last, I guess, year and a half, since we've become really aware of generative AI, has been around the content itself, the quality of content. For example, there's a lot of concerns over deep fake videos, and those are important, right? The ability to make fake videos that seem realistic of, say, important figures, that's a real issue. Our focus is a little bit less, or in this talk at least, is less on particular pieces of convincing content and more about how high quality content, but also very realistic synthetic persona online makes the possibility of astroturfing at scale. And by astroturfing, we mean giving the false impression of ground truth consensus, right, or grassroots consensus. So it's one thing to see a message that says, the U.S. shouldn't interfere with Taiwan. It's a whole other thing if you see lots and lots of people online that you may not know personally and in real life, but they look like a person. They have realistic pictures, realistic content. They talk to each other. They seem very real. And to have them all saying, look, I get that we care about the world, but like, why are we focused on Taiwan and China when I can't get a job here in Lima, Ohio? And that idea of seeing sort of consensus online from people that look like you, it was, we think, a pretty serious threat in information operations. And in particular, generative AI resolves a couple tensions. One is you can do incredibly high quality operations that usually require lots of expensive, hard to get human effort, but now you can get it at scale. Rather than having thousands of fake accounts, you might have millions or tens of millions of fake accounts, all acting in very sophisticated ways. Another thing is the costs are pretty low. You don't need a state level budget to get involved in this. My personal estimate is that you could probably build a decent system that uses fine-tuned, tailored AI models for a couple $100,000, $300,000, and have it work at scale. And we've already seen examples of nation states involved in this. So, China, Russia, and Iran have all recently used generative AI in these astroturfing attempts. They were using off-the-shelf models, so not as sophisticated as, sort of like bespoke or, boutique ones made for them, and so they can be found. But it's pretty sobering that they've already started using them. And then some of the constraints on this stuff, because it's not magic, right? It's not as if, like you can just use AI and it magically makes things work. But some of the challenges is that, training these models is very expensive. So training foundation models, an original large scale model, very expensive, tons of data and compute power. However, there's a solution, and that is you can take these models, off the shelf open source ones, and you can use a little bit of data from your target audience. Maybe if I was to collect social media data from Americans and use that to fine tune a model, or I might have Taiwanese speakers, or I might get like images of people in, Schwabia or Bavaria in Germany, and it's very cheap and easy to fine tune these models to a specific population or purpose. I can do it at home on the weekends and do it very often, not for nefarious purposes, but I do it on my Mac. So I have a consumer laptop, and I can take smaller size models and I can fine tune them to my purposes on consumer hardware. So again, for a nation state or even a moderately funded non-state actor, not a big hurdle. Another one is you have to have good data, right? If I want to teach a model to sound like people from Pittsburgh and Cleveland, I need data of people from, Pittsburgh speakers and people from Cleveland, North Midland speakers. However, again, this is not an incredible barrier. You can scrape the internet, you can get open source data sets, you can have close but not perfect. And also too is again, to do fine tuning, you don't need enormous amounts of material. So it's very possible to fine tune a model, a large language model with 1,000 to 2,000 examples of your target population. So another challenge is this idea of like the data quality underneath the models. I'm sorry, that is actually a duplicate of one, and I'm actually forgetting the. If you can remember, Nathan, what that third one was, tell me, and I'll redo it. And then here's a really serious issue, and that is these models are somewhat stochastic. They're kind of random. Part of their virtue is they can do things somewhat, randomly or unexpected. So that means if you really want to have control over them, you need to kind of lock them down. In our work at RAND developing models, one of our problems is like the most creative models that are the best at solving problems, offering, say, courses of action, are also likely to say and do things that we don't really like a lot. So, for example, an authoritarian regime like the People's Republic of China probably doesn't want a high quality model that goes off the rails and criticizes Xi Jinping. And that one is a hard one to solve, right? The more you control the model, the less well it works. There's actually a Pareto frontier of optimization between model quality and performance versus control over it. The more you try and safety align or control a model, the less well it performs, and finding that sweet spot can be a real challenge. Nathan, you want to take over?
Great, thanks. And so Bill's point about the ease of use, and really generative AI in our argument is lowering the barrier to entry for malign actors, whether foreign or also domestic, to use this technology. And so a good example we point to is in January, ahead of the New Hampshire primary, someone who is not a tech expert by any means used generative AI, publicly available tools, to build and deploy a robocall about President Biden to, assumably influence voters ahead of that primary. And so this is an example of someone who is not nation state, would barely be considered a formidable actor by any definition, but was able to use it and deploy it all with publicly available tools. Doesn't seem to, any of the even basic steps that Bill was talking about. And so really, to us, reinforce the message that this is something that really could change the game for what we should be worried about on social media and broader online sphere as well. Next slide, please. So if anybody can do it, what evidence do we have so far, as Bill mentioned, that China, Russia, or other actors are already getting into it? And yes, we can see from publicly available reporting that the Chinese government is widely assumed to now be using generative AI to better improve its influence operations. We would argue that there's kind of two steps to Chinese government's better influence operations online. First is social media, which has been around for a while and really enabled Chinese government and other malign actors to do better targeting, right? You can kind of pick who you want to be able to message. But then the question is, if you can pick them, can you actually tailor the content to really make full use of that ability, from social media and social media advertising? And the answer now, we argue with generative AI, is yes. So it's a combination of social media and generative AI that really, unfortunately, proven a boon for malign actors online. The early evidence came out, a big key moment was around Taiwan's elections earlier this year in January. And there was, widespread reporting that suspected actors affiliated with the Chinese government were using generative AI to make voice-over videos on YouTube and other means to sway the vote in Beijing's favor. There was also even a last-ditch effort, a day or two before the vote, to make a fake voice message from one of the candidates, again, to kind of influence the vote. So this is really, early indication that the Chinese government was interested in adopting generative AI to build on its pre-existing efforts. In terms of what is it really doing for China? Historically, Chinese efforts for social media manipulation have been kind of cast aside as not well done, right? Really kind of poorly crafted, ineffective overall. This comes not just from kind of Western analysis of what are they actually achieving real world on social media, but also if you actually look at Chinese military and other parts of the party state reflecting on their own success or failures, would they identify long-standing failures in their ability to do cross-cultural communication, foreign language skills. And so again, we argue that generative AI provides them the ability to actually start solving some of those long-standing known problems for them. And what we find in our research, in this report that came out earlier this month, is that at least some in the party state clearly understand the potential of generative AI. We also found evidence that parts of the party state, including the Chinese military, are actually already adopting open source large language models like Meta's Llama model and fine-tuning it just as Bill was talking about. So we think they really are indeed, we can match kind of what the available open source literature from China is saying, and then real world what we're seeing them doing. And so we're going to talk through on the next slide one example of what we argue is pretty cutting edge work from a Chinese military researcher named Bicheng. So next slide. So in a moment, I'm going to turn it over to Bill to actually walk through kind of a technical evaluation of Bicheng's work. But I'll just explain briefly, and we have a whole report on Bicheng as our case study for kind of the technical chops of some Chinese military researchers on this topic. But Bicheng is a Chinese military researcher who spent his entire career as a computer scientist programmer, working on online sentiment, public opinion, public conversations online. And roughly, in the mid 2010s, started working on not just understanding and observing, but influencing public opinion online, what the Chinese government calls online public opinion guidance. And so Bicheng, over 2016 and then 2019 and on, worked to develop an actual entire system to build out this capability to do social media manipulation. And so the wonderful thing about RAND is that you can have a China guy like me and a technical expert like Bill come together and do this analysis. So you don't actually care what I think about this. I want to ask Bill what he thinks reading these texts, because we translated them in English for Bill to actually understand at a technical level what's going on. So Bill, tell us.
Sure. So I think this is really clever. And by the way, so this was designed prior to widespread knowledge and the performance of GPT 3.5, which made a big splash. So I don't know whether Bicheng was aware of GPT-2 at the time, but in his writing, he said, sort of assuming a certain level of AI capability, here's what a system with various agents and resources would do. And what's interesting to me is that really mirrors the current trend. So this year, if you look at what's happening in generative AI and applications in business or across enterprises, it is mostly about systems of agents. So most of us interact with, a single model in a chat window. Where like I go to GPT, Chat GPT or Anthropic, and I'm like, give me a recipe for chocolate cookies, and it answers you and gives you that answer. This instead is, imagine instead of a chat bot, you have rather a system with maybe a model that knows about a certain area, a resource like being able to do execute code, another resource that lets you do Google searches. And by the way, the current version of GPT 4.0 is starting to look like this, right? It's got like, the actual interactions, but also it has a module that connect to the internet and do searches. It has other modules, execute code, to go ahead and do visualization. So this idea of systems of models and resources is a really powerful one. And, he was probably writing this in 2018, 2019, before it was published in 2020. So really, I think very prescient. And in this case, there's sort of two sets of inputs to this, right? So on the left, two input sets. On the right, a bunch of output going into onto social media platforms. On the top, you've got, you're going to get data and you're going to train a bunch of models. So first you're going to have models that know how to generate pictures of Taiwanese families at dinner and pictures of local areas in Taiwan. And then you also have, say, content models that know how to speak like, person in the country, a person in the rural South, like kind of like regional variations, how a college kid speaks. You then have a separate agent, likely a different model, that is in charge of making those content models produce posts, pictures, text. Another agent that actually posts them online, interacts with the platforms. Another model that's supervising the timing, because like human beings have a normal schedule, or they have somewhat regular schedules. It's not rigid. I don't post at 2 o'clock every day. Just had lunch. It was great. But I don't post at 3 in the morning and go, just had lunch, right? So a scheduler that posts things in human-like ways with a kind of a human schedule that is on the same time zone as your target audience and makes sense, but also is variable enough to be very kind of human and pushes that out. But then also in that bottom row, you're going to have public opinion guidance, basically from like the CCP. Here are the themes and messages we want. And actually would probably come not directly from the CCP, but sort of indirectly through the Strategic Support Forces, which is part of the PLA that does information operations and influence ops. And they would put in, here is the messages. Here's the kind of things, here's the way we want to shape the conversation. That gets input into both the actual posts in the themes, don't interfere with Taiwan, focus on your own problems in America, appropriate tone and style, but then also when you do it, who does it, what are the sort of the rhythms of it, and all of that together. And by the way, too, wouldn't be too hard to also add a feedback loop where you have, reception to this. What did better or worse? What were my, what was the effect of my efforts to then improve this? But anyways, Li Bicheng laid out what I think is a very, very plausible, technically sophisticated architecture for how to use AI. And he did this years before the actual best practice, like the models that really do this came available.
Can I jump in here to add? We're arguing that Li Bicheng is probably one of several, if not many, folks supporting broader Chinese government efforts, but he's a really useful case study that provides us insight into the technological sophistication that Chinese actors probably possess, and that this aligns pretty well with what we're actually seeing them doing on the real world side. And I think Li Bicheng is such a great case study because he's also wonderfully transparent and honest about what he's doing, right? So we got turned on to his articles because he wrote one in 2019 that said, just in the introduction, the current way we do mechanized sock puppets basically sucks. It's not very good, but my idea for using AI to do it is way better. So listen to me. So that's why we're picking him as our kind of representative case study. We think he is indeed one of the leading folks out there, but there's a lot of folks in China involved in supporting these efforts. And so, and I just, appreciate Bill giving us the technical analysis of all this. It's wonderful. Thanks, Bill. Over to you.
Yep. So a recent case study, you may have seen it in the news this summer, but it's essentially DOJ found a social media bot farm operation run by Russia Today, along with the Federal Security Service. I think it's the FSB for Russia. But essentially, they did something that was very clever. Now, the content generation wasn't at the highest level of sophistication that we've mentioned, of this fine tuning. What they did do is they used basically a database of kinds of people and were able to create like authentic looking persona, like a house husband in Cleveland, and a high-tech worker on Manhattan, or in San Francisco, or like a college kid and whatever. So this idea of using demographic databases and databases for themes to on the fly generate content for realistic persona, that's a real innovation. They've done it in the past using human skilled workers, right? So if you've heard of the IRA, the Internet Research Agency, having really tailored high quality content from Russia is an old trick. But rather than paying people in St. Petersburg skilled labor to do it, they did this procedurally using generative AI. And from what we've read, unlike China, who appears to be all like full steam ahead on AI, Russia was like not happy with the results, and they may be reverting back to like good old human tradecraft. I can never say the Russian names for it, but like essentially there's a thing called reflexive control theory, and a kind of idea of information conflict that Russia has. And like historically, Russia has competed with the West not through technological superiority, but through like theory crafting and skillful application of theory, and they appear to be reverting back to that. Nathan, anything else for this slide?
Nope. Great. All right. So we've talked through the threat. Now this is Rand, so we should also tell you perhaps something you can do about it. And so we really want to highlight, our view that the U.S. government, and not just U.S. government, but democracies around the world, our concern is are not quite prepared for potential challenge posed by generative AI and social media manipulation. So our concern is grounded looking back at what happened in 2016. And although some folks maybe could have seen it coming, it was certainly a shock to the broader US government and broader kind of policy community. So we wanted really to encourage folks to think ahead of the curve. And so, I think this kind of project story is a useful way to think about that, right? In the summer of 2022 is when Bill and I pitched this project. We got it funded internally. We had a whole project plan actually, to execute research, some on Bicheng, but ChatGPT came out and Bill said, stop the presses, abandon the plan. What we really need to focus on is the implications of generative AI. So we drafted the report, got it out last year, and we've really been harking on this message that it's important to think about this threat and get ahead of this threat as much as possible, especially now that we're just 2 weeks out from the election and really thinking about the implications of this in the real world today. And so next slide, Bill, we can talk through some of what we're encouraging US government and other democracies around the world to think through. We bucket them really in 5 categories, and we're happy to talk through any of them if there's interest. So first is risk reduction, right? How can we actually minimize the harm that comes of generative AI? And this is not just actions that the US government could take, but also, encouraging social media platforms and others to be more transparent, more responsible, redoubling efforts to actually cut down on fake accounts on social media, which we argue might be the low-hanging fruit these days as generative AI really dramatically improves the ability to generate content at scale. So risk reduction is a big one. Second, also improving media literacy and improving government trustworthiness, right? Trying to kind of inoculate against some of these potential harms. Rand has a wide body of literature on truth decay and how to respond to truth decay at a kind of a society-wide level. And so we're building on some of that literature in this recommendation. And the third is calling for US government transparency and other democratic government transparency, increased public reporting to really reinforce government trustworthiness. Again, especially looking at elections, how can the US government tell the American people more about the actual intent, capabilities, maybe consequences of malign actors' use of social media? How can we make sure people still have faith in the election and electoral process representing the will of the people and not somebody else's voice from Beijing or from Moscow? And then lastly, we don't think this can only be solved in the US. This really requires a global response. So we're encouraging the US government to cooperate and enhance engagement with other governments around the world. We think focusing on China threat, Taiwan absolutely should be center stage for that effort, right? US government should absolutely support Taiwan's ability to share its lessons learned from being on the front lines, facing Chinese disinformation every day, sharing it not just with the United States, but other countries that might be affected. And then also, talking with other countries and sharing, what we're seeing China doing and making sure they're aware in defending their own elections. And so just to close out, we'll wrap up with a couple of the related products. I think we've been putting them in the chat, but the first report we put out last September is this nice, pretty blue or teal graphic, the perspective, kind of outlining both the technical angle and Taiwan as a case, hypothetical case study here. I testified to Congress in February. And then lastly, just earlier this month, we put out the top right report on Dr. Bicheng, walking through at kind of a technical level, what he's doing and how that fits in broader Chinese party state efforts.
That was incredible, wasn't it?
Thank you very much for an incredible talk. Bill and Nathan, thanks for self-congratulating yourself. Bill, I appreciate that. Really great, interesting stuff. We've got lots of questions that have begun to queue up here. We'll try to answer as many of these as we can, given we've got, 15, under 15 minutes, well, maybe 20 minutes. I'm shortchanging us here to get to all of them. So we'll do our best. The first question is a meaty one, and it's got two parts. I'll start with the part that most relates to the governance issue that, Nathan, you just highlighted, which is how much can a state like the US intervene in ensuring the management regulation of this sort of AI when large parts of the world, maybe the global south, is largely unaware of the potential dangers of their own data?
Yeah, I think this is a great question. The U.S. government is moving toward both supporting, ethical AI development, trying to encourage responsible AI development, and also you see, initial moves by the Biden administration and Congress to think about how should we support balanced regulation on this issue, right? And I think, as the question mentions, this can't only be a U.S. solution because, as Bill likes to say, this technology is now ubiquitous, right? If we regulate it in the United States, there's absolutely benefits in doing, but China doesn't regulate it and puts out their own open source models that people on the internet can use widely. That is still going to be a capability that other actors can leverage. And so we have to think about dealing with this, not just purely from a regulation point of view, but also other ways as well. I think also the United States has an opportunity here to kind of lead the globe in thinking about, from a governor's perspective, how to deal with it. And so I think there's a lot of opportunities for U.S. government to do better outreach to other parts of the world and educate them, help them think through some of these challenges, as were mentioned. Bill, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, and I think one thing we do too is maybe be better examples. So earlier this summer, it came to light that U.S. Special Operations Command engaged in an influence operation in the South China Sea, regional area, trying to get people in that area to not use Chinese vaccines. That's a bad look. We look like the bad guy doing that kind of thing. So I think in addition to regulation and technical solutions, probably if the U.S. practices the right kind of, doing influence rather than say very sort of negative, harmful stuff, I think we have more credibility on that stage.
Great. I'm going to go to the next question, sort of deferring on the second part of the first one, just to get to as many of these as I can. How might AI influence presidential elections that are apparently upon us here in the US? Can you speak to that? What are pathways through which AI might influence our elections?
So I'll offer one thought. So there's clearly a lot of effort that goes into trying to influence elections and major political events through influence efforts, right? So Brexit's a good example. 2016 US election. In 2020, there was a RAND study that I was involved in that I led where we found clear evidence of a Russian effort to influence the election. And then we also have found in RAND research coordinated efforts, or at least complementary aligned efforts between China and Russia to try and influence the news narrative about COVID, the use of vaccines and tracking software, that kind of stuff. Or not tracking, but whatever you call it when you like your contact software for whether or not you've met people, whatever. And I think what's important is clearly our adversaries are investing in this. they're doing it, it's not exactly clear how much influence it has. There's a lot of research that shows people, even when they kind of aren't sure if content is true or not, if it aligns with their deep beliefs, they're like, it may not be true, but it speaks to my truth, to my deeper truth. What I would say is some of the most sophisticated work I've seen on actually quantifying results shows that there is effects at the margin, but they're small effects. So I can imagine some people at the margin being impacted either way, but it may not be like massive swings. Like you were really progressive one day and now you're going to vote the opposite tomorrow. Over.
Yeah. And I think it's useful to put in context, as Bill said, absolutely need to consider what is the real world consequence of this. But also, where does social media or online influence efforts fit in this broader toolkit that both China, Russia have when they try to influence foreign political processes, right? And so China, for example, has a very well-developed, widespread capability that spans interpersonal, economic carrots, yes, online, but a whole host of things that social media is a part of and maybe a growing part of, but not the full story. And so very much need to put it in context. For me, what I focus on is understanding the intent, and in our case, Chinese intent to use this technology, and the fact that technology is getting better and observable real world kind of uptick of successful outreach by China using the technology. Just to say that historically, Chinese influence operations on social media were commonly derided as not being very good. Now we're seeing a quantifiable improvement when they're using generative AI. And so that's what concerns me, that the trend line is probably going to get worse before it gets better. And the last thing I'll say is that to understand what actually is going on in the real world, usually we're relying on reporting, self-reporting from social media platforms, some amount from governments, and some amount from independent researchers like Bill and other RAND colleagues who did those studies for 2020. But our concern also is that social media platforms are not fully transparent. They're not readily putting information out there, and we simply don't know what we don't know, right? Our concern is that the generative AI campaigns that have been caught so far, maybe they were just the bad ones, the easy ones to catch. And it's hard for us to know what we're not catching. Maybe we're catching 100%, but seeing that we probably very likely we're not catching 100% of social media manipulation efforts pre-generative AI, unlikely that we're catching 100% of it now. So that's also humbling.
I'm back. I was dropped off. I think not attributable to any malicious activities, internet glitch. Did you answer the question about differentiating true versus false?
No.
You did not. Well, yeah, I think you sort of did, but that's the next question, which is, as AI capabilities evolve, how robust are methodologies to differentiate true versus false information? So you sort of touched on it, but maybe you want to say more about that.
Right. So, I mean, one is like truth or falsity. That's a hard question, right? Like, is something true or false? I don't want to touch that. Is it generated through AI or is it human content? Is a more clear question. And it's really hard. Forensics on generative AI content is difficult. It's a cat and mouse game. And I'd say like right now, the advantage lays with the offense. So for example, the most common way of generating fake pictures is through stable diffusion models. And there are some methods, it's not easy, but you can do things like stable diffusion works by like teaching models how to go from a real picture to noise, from a real picture to like, snow on a TV screen that's dead. You flip it around, you go from like snow to a real picture. There's methods to decompose them back, and you can see like faint outlines, and that's like a trick for a classifier to tell it was fake. There are other new methods that are developing to make that harder to detect and make completely obviate it. Or, for example, on generating, text, there are stats methods to try and look for non-human perturbations or variations in language, like word variations that are not very good. They need lots of text and even things like watermarking. So a lot of people are like, we should have watermark this content. If it's made by, AI, it should be watermarked. Well, so one, that only works for folks that want to watermark, right? So if you get OpenAI and Anthropic and Gemini from Google and they all agree to it, great. Except, I don't know, if Baidu and Qwen 2.5 don't want to do it, or, and also too, the best methods for this, the least harmful methods for doing this are at generation. They don't involve training. They don't also involve messing up the model. They maintain model quality. It's a really interesting paper yesterday in Nature magazine about a great method to watermark at inference, low computational cost, doesn't degrade quality. It actually works when you get to about 400, 500 words, in a message maybe. So it's like pretty good, but it only works if you want to do it on your platform. And if I use open source models, well, I just wouldn't do it then. So I think this is a really, really hard ask. I don't know where the technical solutions are right now.
Great. Next question. What incentive does Dr. Li Bicheng have to publish what he's actually doing? Why would he, or I mean, for that matter, anyone like him, I know you've showcased this one individual, if you took the class of folks doing stuff like this, why would they share this information for all to see?
Yeah, it's a great question. And that's absolutely something we think about of, are the sources that we're using reliable, accurate, or are they misdirection in their own right? We leveraged a high number of different sources from Li Bicheng and other parts of the Chinese government that all kind of align and corroborated back to the same core line of effort. We feel very comfortable with high confidence that this is, actually what Li Bicheng is trying to do. I think the probably easiest explanation for why Li Bicheng is publishing these things is that because for any society, any kind of research community to function, sustain itself, and actually benefit from the research any one individual is putting out, there has to be some amount of open publication to share this information. And so, I think that's just kind of nature of the beast for how academia, whether in the United States or in China, even, within the Chinese military and Chinese government apparatuses, benefit from their own research. He's publishing these articles in Chinese in places that he probably doesn't think a whole lot about who's reading them. As part of our job at RAND is to be able to find them and exploit them and kind of appreciate them for what they are. So we were very happy to have found Li Bicheng as a representative case study, but in the report we also survey other parts of the Chinese government that are more or less saying the same thing.
Great. This one's a little bit speculative, but I know you all can do that. Do you believe that information warfare, as it develops more with increasing technological innovations, will be able to mobilize more individuals for political violence?
So, okay, just retreating from the sort of technical questions about AI generation, just more of an information and influence question. There is a lot of evidence, there's a lot of research on this. This is a really important topic, right? What is the influence in the real world of online, or influence activities, right? And again, the big picture is it appears to work on the margin. So like, for example, there are lots and lots of people that say really nasty things on the internet. A teeny tiny fraction of them actually do something in the real world. It's very rare. But the concern is, and there is some evidence that there are tipping points. You can be motivated to do stuff. And when you look at some of our really high profile cases, an example would be like the Comet Pizza, the guy that believed that, there was a secret entrance to the tunnels, whatever, like that guy got influenced online and moved from being a kind of a normal dad in North Carolina to I'm going to die saving children in the dungeons underneath Comet Pizza in Washington, D.C. So that's an example of someone being pushed. So, and the other thing I would say is that this happens in a context of high polarization. So we are in a very polarized, world right now in the U.S. So within a highly polarized, U.S. context, in a place where in a culture where, violent solutions make sense to a lot of people, yeah, I think there's real possibility that better and better and more sophisticated messages that you have to take violent action could indeed move people at the margin. And like, look, like getting 5 more people to do something bad, that's a lot. Like, I don't want someone walking in, like one more person walking in somewhere using a weapon because they feel like I'm going to save America. Over.
Thank you. Is there currently adequate coordination between U.S. intelligence oversight agencies and AI development companies? You might broaden that to just government and private sector coordination if you wish.
Yeah, so I mean, I can't speak to any sort of back channel, like, I don't know, maybe someone at whatever agency is talking to somebody, but in the broader picture, the US government has taken a generally hands-off approach to regulating AI companies. There was definitely contact, there's definitely talk, there's definitely research happening, but unlike the EU, which has developed a lot of regulation, unlike the CCP, which is publishing regulation, but also steering their development efforts. The US, really the only thing we have really is an executive order telling the government, hey, government, you have to within, Treasury, within commerce, whatever, develop policies over the use of generative AI and how you're going to, use it, don't use it, that kind of thing. So I think there could be a lot more coordination with AI companies. The particulars, right? Because regulation has entailments, but it's certainly worth a conversation. And I think we could have a better, broader conversation about this. Over.
Great. I'm going to sort of shift gears and I'll come back to another question that's in the queue. Can you speak a little bit to the collaboration that is ongoing with this research? The person asked about specific individuals, or even the Critical Internet Studies Institute. I know that this work is informed by a lot of your professional collaborations. Could you say a little bit about that context for this RAND work?
So I think we could do more to collaborate. There are other places doing good technical work across the academic world, in the sort of FFRDC research world. And then sometimes places that are like being funded in the academic world get defunded and then suddenly they're gone. So that's a real issue. I'd love to see more coordination and collaboration with the platforms. So I personally have had the experience of being asked to work, with Google. So, Google has a kind of a harm reduction, a part of Alphabet, and they've sponsored RAND research on detecting like violent extremism kind of content. They've been kind of open with us. And, Section 203 of the Communications Decency Act gives, platforms, broad protections, and it's up to them if they want to collaborate or not. There's no real stick behind that. So maybe Google wants to, maybe Meta doesn't want to. Although also I would say is Meta currently, while I have a dimmer view of how Facebook operates and their willingness to be transparent, the Fundamental AI Research Institute that Meta sponsors is doing amazing work and publishing really great stuff that's open source. So it's kind of all over the map from my perspective.
I can add a little bit about our motivation for the report that we put out. I would argue that there's a lot of effort to understand and kind of quantify what I would call the output side of what China is doing online, right? Observing real world behavior, leveraging the reports from Meta and other, social media platforms about the accounts that they're taking down. But what we thought was lacking was a really nuanced understanding of how the Chinese government conceptualizes, operationalizes, and tries to deploy these capabilities. And so that's why we did this study, to really serve as a companion to other efforts already out there. Great places like German Marshall Fund's Hamilton Dashboard, 2.0 does a great job tracking these, publicly acknowledged Chinese government accounts on social media, the narratives they're putting out, for example. But we wanted to provide more of the internal look on the input side of how the Chinese government thinks about these things. And that's why we try to include as much technical detail as we could in the report for others who are more up on the technical chops, not just Bill, but people like Bill, to be able to really try to appreciate how sophisticated at least some of these Chinese government efforts are.
This question you might interpret in a couple of ways. I'll let you do that and answer as you see fit. What are some ways in which the US, perhaps through DoD entities, could reclaim the high ground with respect to narratives influencing public opinion on social media? Are there scalable solutions?
Okay, so there's two parts to that. One is reclaiming the high ground. Two is how do you operationalize it in efficient, scalable ways. On the first part, we've done a lot of research on this. There's been a ton. So our truth decay effort, which a lot of it went through, I think, and some of it was just RAND General. A lot of it went through NSRD though, through this. And Chris Paul, one of our, he's still at RAND, although he's also over at Naval Postgraduate School. He's sort of like the granddaddy in a lot of ways of this kind of work. That line of research has really showed like plugging the dike is not a good strategy. Running around and like clarifying facts and fact checking people and trying to like correct things is a fool's errand. Essentially, the way to counter bad information or a bad story is with a better story. So I think the guiding principle is if we want to try and tell our story on a global network and counter disinformation or malicious information, is telling a good story and being a good actor ourselves. So I think it's possible. And yes, absolutely, I can imagine scalable means that get our story out and like everywhere, active, telling our story in ways that are meaningful and influential. So yes, I think so.
One of our recommendations in the report is for US government and specifically DoD to do a pretty comprehensive independent review of their own activities and make sure that whatever they are doing aligns with their bigger strategic priorities and to make sure that they're aligned. Seems that based on some of the public reporting that Bill mentioned, there's a chance that they're not very aligned. And so we want to, make sure that DoD and other parts of the US government are really taking a step back and ensuring that what they're doing, kind of actually fulfills their high level, strategic missions.
And also recently, I guess a year and a half ago, we published RAND, again in NSRD, we published a ethical operations guide to ethical influence operations. So we actually provided criteria for risk assessment, for assessing ethics, to going away from like, well, is it legal to, well, is it ethical? And the thing is, the US military does a really good job with the ethics of force. Like we train people in the US military from day one how to use force in ethical ways that follow the law of land warfare. If we can do as well as we do with the use of force, I'm pretty sure we can figure out how to be ethical and effective with influence operations. Done.
Great. I'm going to ask just two more questions, and I think we'll try to ask two more questions, and we'll be out of time. So, one is, who do you think is best positioned to uncover, shine a light on AI generated content from malicious actors? Is it social media companies, government, someone else? I have a feeling I know how you might answer, but maybe if you answer that quickly, we'll take one more.
Yeah, so I think the social media platforms have a huge role. They're the ones that actually see stuff. They have the data. They can choose to share it or not. They can be like, yeah, we took down this one. We don't mention the other 20 ones we did. So I think they have a big role to play in it. I can imagine government coordination across academic labs because the forensics require a lot of technical solutions. If we want to science this out, we need coordination between the scientists. So I can imagine public-private collaborations that take a shine on this. And then also too, I can imagine a different paradigm for social media companies. Look, if a social media platform's business model is having the most accounts possible and charging ad rates based on the most accounts possible, it is in their best interest to have accounts on there regardless. If instead it's I'm charging based on the quality of these, like if there actually are human beings, they're verified, different story. But I think until social media platforms have incentives that are aligned with sort of transparency and honesty, it's a harder sell. Over.
Great. Owing to the robustness of that answer, and given that we've got a couple of minutes here, we want to be respectful of everybody's time. We're going to end the session here today, but this is just the beginning of a long conversation, we hope, in more ways than one. Thank you again, Nathan and Bill, for this excellent presentation and for so thoughtfully answering the questions. Thanks to our audience for asking really thoughtful questions, and there's really good ones that are in the queue that I wish we had gotten to, but we'll find maybe some way to get to them. And all of you, if you're not already on our mailing list, please sign up to receive the RAND Policy Currents newsletter and NSRD Security Upfront newsletter. Rajni has links to both to subscribe in chat. And there's going to be a poll question, the results of which will not be shown to the audience. I defer to David Cherry to put that up, but I think he already has. Please answer that. And thank you all so very much, and hope we see you at the next Policy Lab event.